going on, guys? Welcome back to the Trank, and today we are going to be making a leather sheath for my Leatherman Wingman. It's kind of a tongue twister, and what we're going to be doing is basically making a simple belt sheath and also having a spot for a small Olight, flashlight, and a pen. So we'll see. I've got some scraps and some leather here, and let's see what we can do. I'm going to start off by getting a block the same size as this, and we're going to be wet molding the leather, and we'll go from there.
So to get started off, I've just first cut a piece of MDF to the same dimension as the Leatherman Wingman. That way I don't need to actually use the Wingman when making the mold, because in the past water, even through plastic wrap, will seep through and start to rust the metal. So here I'm using the block, and I'm just slowly creating the wet form around it.
Okay, so the mold's good to go. You can see we've got it nice and snug here. Keep that block in there until this leather dries. And again, you'll see we have these two little spots, and that's going to be because we're actually going to use that to attach small flashlight and pen slot, and then that'll bezel the light, and the pen will actually sit on this little guy.
So once the mold is complete, you can just go ahead and, well, here I'm just testing the fit, making sure there's good contact, and there is. And the next step is just slowly trim down a little section at the top. That's going to allow for easier access to the Wingman when it's completely in the sheath there. And so to do this, I'm just creating a small cutout, and I'm just using a straight edge, and then I'm using the back of a plane blade to actually get a little bit of a round curve there. And that's pretty easy. You just take that out, and that way you have a little sort of a grab area to grab the knife. With that done, I go ahead and trim the mold to its final size. This part's a little tricky because it's hard to get the straight edge completely flat on the leather, since it's got the staples and some of it's sort of bent and crooked with those raised portions, but it doesn't have to be exact. You can kind of work the edges afterwards with either some sandpaper or canvas or whatever you want to use, but you do want to get a pretty straight edge with equal spacing from the main portion of the sheath. That way your stitch line will also be able to have nice spacing and be even.
Alright, so I did a little bit of cleanup work, and we've actually got a pretty nice looking form here for the blade. So now what we're going to do is attach a backing, and it's going to have a strap that comes over and buttons here. We're also going to add, like I said, a little spot here for a little pen and a flashlight. It's going to be pretty cool. Not this flashlight, but imagine something kind of sitting there like that on each side. So let's keep going.
So the next step was to find a piece that can be used for the backing. Now the backing is going to be stitched onto the water or the wet formed part, and it's also going to have a flap that comes around and buttons over the top to make it into a pouch. So first I just put on one straight edge with the ruler, and here I'm just marking out the rough dimension of what I want this to be. And the cool thing about the leather working is you can really just kind of do things by eye as you go if it's nothing too fancy or complicated like the sheath like this. So that makes it fun. It's sort of a one afternoon project. You can just sit down and go. And the next step was to use a bit of, I want the pen and the flashlight, instead of being held with a leather tab, to be held with a piece of elastic. And so here I'm just using some braided elastic that you can buy at any fabric store, and I'm just forming it around the light and pen, and then adding a stitch line to hold it into a sleeve. And I just do this with a few passes of the sewing machine. Makes it plenty strong. And you can see I leave a little tab there because that's what I'm going to actually use to sew onto the leather itself. And then here, to give a little bit more curvature and profile to the flap that comes over, I'm just using a plate to add, again, a nice little curve there. And you can see this gives us a nice flap for the sheath. So before I actually attach the backing to the wet molded portion, I want to go ahead and stitch on a belt loop. And I'm making sure I don't want to stitch both sides, I want to add buttons, because one thing I really hate personally is belt loops where it's, fixed on each end of the loop, and so you have to slide it onto your belt before ever putting your belt on, and I just find this to be pretty annoying. So I'm adding a couple buttons so you can put it on once your belt's already on, which is how I prefer to have sheaths and such. Here I'm just burnishing the edges. And using a pair of dividers, I just scribe in a stitch line, and then I use the chisel to pound in some holes for the stitch. So for the stitching, I'm just using a bit of wax thread, and I'm just adding a saddle stitch, which is a really simple but very strong stitch. It doesn't take very long, although it does get a little tedious at times, but it goes relatively quick. And then at the end I just tie a reef knot in order to connect the two threads and tie it off. So now that the one side of the belt loop is stitched on, I can go ahead and add the hardware for the buttons. And I'm again going with 2 buttons just to give it an a little bit of extra security when it's on the belt there. So you just start off by chiseling out the holes, and then you just use the included punches to attach the buttons. It's pretty easy, and it's actually pretty satisfying because they turn out really nice looking and they're nice and sturdy. These aren't solid, steel or brass or anything special buttons. They're pretty much El Cheapos, but it'd be cool to get some higher end hardware in the future. But since I'm still just learning leatherworking, I'm just using some inexpensive hardware here, but they stay in place, and I've been wearing it and it's been just fine. Now I can finally get on to putting on some cement, contact cement on the back in order to connect this to the wet molded sheath. And I just do this to help hold it in place while I'm doing the stitching. So you just put on the rubber cement, contact cement, and leave it for about 15 minutes, and you come back and press it on and it holds. And with that done, I again take the dividers and mark in my scribe line. You want to get close to the raised portion on the sheath with the stitching so that there's not much wiggle room for your knife, so try to just get as close as you can. And then again, just use the chisels and punch out your holes. And again, this is another process I really enjoy because it's really simple, but the holes turned out nice and even spacing, and they just look really good. Now I originally tried to use the chisel over the elastic fabric, but it would just pull out. So what I ended up just doing is just putting the holes into the leather, and then I put a little double-sided tape on the elastic when I was doing the stitching, like right here. And then I just carefully stitch through both the leather and the elastic, and the tape holds it in place while I do that. That way it gets stitched on, but it holds in place just fine. So putting in you get about 5 stitches through the elastic, which is plenty to hold it in place. So here I'm just doing the bottom of the sheath, and again, this is all just done with a saddle stitch. And once again, I just tie a quick reef knot, otherwise known as a square knot, to tie off the threads. So now I come back and add the hardware for the button that's going to actually close the sheath. So again, there's no special planning with this. I just kind of do it as I go, and I eye where I want the button to be. Of course, I center it and such, but first I just add in the female part of the button, and then once you have that, you can go over to the male part and just hammer that into place. I went with a pretty good fold over just because I think it looks cool, and I kind of like it to come over the pen and the flashlight a little bit. And so again, here I'm just hammering the male end in, and with that, this sheath is done. So if you're looking for a hobby to get into, guys, I've been surprised with how not steep the learning curve for leatherworking is. It's really enjoyable, and it's not too hard, and you only need $35, $40 worth of tools to really get started. That's all I have, and I've been doing just fine. But you can really, it's cool to be able to make things that fit your needs when it comes to more like fabrics instead of woodworking. So I've been really enjoying it, and I'm gonna continue doing it. So if you enjoyed this video, please be sure to check out my others and subscribe, and we'll see you on the next one. Thanks for watching.